Hi, I'm Tyler Austin. Welcome back to the Skylight Books podcast, Skylight Books, where I'm a bookseller, 1818 Vermont. You should obviously come out and check out the store. And again, like I said, thanks again for tuning into the podcast. Today, I'm joined by Alex Pappademas, who is the author of Keanu Reeves' Most Triumphant, The Movies and Meaning of an Irrepressible Icon, and writer and host of the acclaimed podcast, The Big Hit Show. His work has also appeared in GQ, the New York Times, and Grantland. Today, we are going to be discussing his upcoming work, Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gamblers, and Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan. Alex, thanks so much for jumping on the pod with me today.
So happy to be here, Tyler. Thank you.
Yeah, there's nothing like getting a chance to just talk about Steely Dan. It's what we all live for.
I have gotten to do it in the last few weeks so much, which is really great to have this be my job, to talk to people that are as unreasonably obsessed with Steely Dan as I am. I'm not speaking to a lot of Dan agnostic interviewers, put it that way. Yeah. It's a self-selecting group of people who want to talk about this, which is great. We wanted this to be, we wanted this to be something that you could give to the people who maybe aren't, convinced of Steely Dan's greatness. But let's face it, like, this is first and foremost for the true heads. And it's been nice to connect with so many people that kind of share our love of this band.
Absolutely. I mean, because it is like a fierce sort of love. I mean, it is an undying, like true dyed sort of love when it comes to this band, I feel like. And it inspires the kind of thing where it's like you don't really meet the passing Steely Dan fan in this world very often.
No, I mean, I'm sure, like, there's people who are like, yeah, I love Reelin' in the Years, and kind of don't go in, because they do have, 7 like giant hits that you would hear if you just listen to, Coast Radio or whatever, and your oldies station. Like, you could just sort of, experience that at the surface level. But, anybody who's going to get excited about, Caves of Altamira or whatever, it's like, I'm kind of like putting out a bat signal to a certain audience for sure. And but they're everywhere. They're within they are the Steely Dan fans are controlling the wheels of culture right now. And there's a judge, so they're highly placed in all these institutions, and they want to talk to us, and it's been really fun.
It's awesome. Well, yeah, quickly, just right up top, I want to say also you'll be having an event at Skylight Books, 1818 North Vermont, on May 31st. I believe it's 7:00, might be 7:30. But either way,
get there at 7. Just show up.
Get there at 7.
Hang
out. We're gonna have Steely Dan on the box. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be a party. So it's gonna be an awesome event. You're talking with Matthew Spector in conversation about.
Yeah, that is correct. Matthew Spector, the author of the amazing Always Crashing in the Same Car, among other things. But yeah, that is a great book, by the way. If you are excited about this book, you will, and you don't know about that book, you will love that book. It's really great. It's an amazing book about sort of kind of gentlemen losers in Hollywood and all of those things. And Matthew kind of tracing his own life through the artists that he's been obsessed with. There's stuff in there, Warren Zevon, Thomas McGuane, people like that. It's like I'm thrilled to death that he's doing it. Like, I know him a little bit, but like I'm so psyched that he was available to talk. I think it's gonna be a really fun conversation, and he's stoked about it too.
That's awesome. It's gonna be a great event. We're gonna have a great time. So yeah, please make sure to come out for that. So I guess just I'll start sort of here at the beginning. What was sort of the true impetus for this? I mean, obviously beyond your Steely Dan fandom.
Yeah, I mean, I've been, this all goes back to Jones and my mutual friend Jessica Hopper, who started a job with the University of Texas Press out of UT Austin, sort of acquiring books for their for their imprint, but specifically for their American music series. Jessica and I had just sort of gotten laid off together recently. We'd worked together. We'd known each other for a while, but we'd worked together just at MTV News for a minute. And she was doing this UT thing, and she's like, "What's a music book that you could write?" And, if you wanted to, if you sort of basically, if I gave you the opportunity to write a music book for UT, like, what would you want to do? Like, anything at all. And I was like, I think I could write a Steely Dan book. Because I kind of, both of my books are kind of the product of me saying, like, what am I not going to get tired of thinking about? Because I'm going to have to sustain through a process that's longer. Like, I'm 45 years old, and most of my writing has been, I've been writing for 20 years, and most of it has been like 4,000 words at maximum. So, like, writing books is like, it was very daunting to think about it, because it's like, what am I going to be able to, what's going to sort of power me through this process, like at the, in the hard parts? Because writing a book is, some days it just fucking sucks. And it's basically, it's like, and I knew that was going to be the case. And I've sort of like started and stopped, like, over the years because of it. And so it has to be something that I never get tired of thinking about. So I never get tired of talking about Keanu Reeves, thinking about Keanu Reeves. And I never get tired of sort of pondering the mysteries of Steely Dan. So I was, I think, like, pretty far down the road with a proposal. Like, I think I had, like, I don't know if I was writing sample chapters yet, but I had definitely kind of broken it out into what I wanted to do. And, like, I think my pitch to Jessica was, it was like Maggie Nelson's Bluettes.
Okay.
About Steely
for
Dan.
The audio, those listening, Alex just made that appear off screen like a magician. That was amazing. It was so near to you.
Yeah, well, no, I'm in a room full of, this is where all my books are. So, like, I actually, like, I'm in my garage, but, like, this is where I keep all of my, the bulk of my and my wife's sort of lifelong book collection is out here, because we just never figured out we don't have shelves in the house.
Yeah.
So,
struggle of space, the book collection always. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like, I'm always, like, jealous of people. Like, it's like, I don't care if you have a pool, but if you have built-ins, like, I feel like you're a god. Like, I'm just like, how did you do that? So, as, like, I was kind of doing it, and it was going to be like, so that book is all, like, micro essays. Like, it's a really short, just like a paragraph long kind of, like, observation. It's all about the color blue. And it's like, it's amazing. Maggie Nelson, you know how good Maggie Nelson is. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You people listening to the Skylight podcast, too. I don't need to explain anything about that. Read Bluettes, read the Argonauts. Like, come on. So I'd done that. I was working on that, and then, kind of out of nowhere, although this was something that she'd been planning to do for a long time, the great Joan Lemay, who's a longtime friend of Jessica's and a sort of a professional acquaintance of mine in, like, a former life, but, like, we've actually never really met in person, and we've never sort of thought about collaborating, announced on Instagram that she was going to do a zine called Danzine, and she was going to draw every person mentioned, every fictional character, every, real person, sort of imaginary person from the songs of Steely Dan. And Jessica and I both saw that, and we're like, that's an amazing organizing principle for a book about Steely Dan. That's such a good, like, hook. It's such a good, like, rubric to organize all of this stuff under. And so Jessica immediately texted Joan and was like, Joni, this is not a zine. This is a book. Are you kidding? Like, we're then sort of, like, basically kind of matchmaked that process. And then I kind of reconfigured what I was thinking about. And so a lot of the stuff that I ended up doing it for this book was in the proposal when it was just going to be my book, but it was like, it just kind of, it just made it sort of, it was just a different way to think about it. And it narrowed everything down in a nice way, and made it, relatively easy to kind of think about it. Cause I like a structure, I'm like, it's hard to think about, like, what are you going to do? Like, you have to write a 240 page book about something. And even if it's something a lot about already and are excited to learn more about, it's like, where do you even, like, there's the quote from Kurt Vonnegut about writing a novel is, it's like putting on a suit of armor to attack a hot fudge sundae, which I love. It's just like, what are you even, like, where do you begin? And, like, it's, like, I love that. I think it's true of nonfiction too. It's like, you have this giant sort of subject that you can go into. And so once it was like, okay, Joan's going to do a portrait of G. Gordon Liddy, for Daddy G, for Chino
Gee,
Daddy G, and she's gonna imagine
my old school.
Yeah, for my old school. So she's gonna draw Gordon Liddy, and she's gonna do sort of a portrait of him and Chino, who we've decided is like his sort of informant on the inside, who's kind of narking the rest of the Bard College stoners out to Daddy G, which is something that happened in the life of Steely Dan. For people who don't know, like when they were at Bard College, they were both caught up in this giant drug bust that's like a historic drug bust in the history, where like the local PD, with the help of the county sheriff of the county where Bard is, I forget the name of it, but he was the county sheriff, and it's G. Gordon Liddy, who goes on in a few years to be one of the Watergate plumbers, and sort of goes on to be infamous, and goes to prison and for his involvement in Watergate and everything, and is like the kind of the guy. Who G. Gordon Liddy is, but like it's sort of, so once I knew that so it's going to be a portrait of G. Gordon Liddy, I'm going to write an essay that goes with that deals with Steely Dan, and so that's how I'm going to talk about my old school and like about sort of that, and about Bard and stuff like that. So it just was like, it was a way to, for me, it became a way to just organize the thoughts that I had about this and keep it from being kind of the thing that I was imagining. I think probably would have been hard to structure and might have been confusing for people. And I think it's just sort of like, oh, this is about Jack from Do It Again. This is about the protagonist of Do It Again, and we're going to talk about Do It Again through the lens of this character. And I think like once we had that, I think it just it was awesome. And then like the other the other reason it's a good idea is that this is now this it's this beautiful book that has like its own kind of visual identity that you don't always get with a music book, where you're kind of like it's sort of it's kind of in the shadow of the artist's visual identity a little bit. And I think that's now sort of has its own thing. And I think it's like it's affected like the tone of the book, I think, because there's such like Joan's stuff is so colorful and joyous, and it's such a great way to talk about these like depressing stories, like these poor people who are kind of doomed and self-deluded and everything. And so I kind of like that it takes it to like sort of almost like a fairy tale place, and and some of it reminds me of like like Alice in Wonderland illustrations or something like that. And I love that about it, because that's like goes to a place that I never could have taken it. I never could have done that with it. So I think it's just been, I've been saying this a lot, but I have friends who are in comics, and like they talk about when they write a script and then they get the art back from the artist, and it's like something that they could like it's so much cooler than they imagined this scene being. And I'm always jealous of that experience when I hear about it. And that's what this was like. That like we would like we were sending stuff back and forth, and Joan was like doing these paintings as I was doing the essays, and I was like, shit, like that's so much greater than like I would have thought. We sort of talked about, we were like, I'd be like, yeah, I think the third world man is a guy with a tinfoil hat, he's like a conspiracy guy or something, and like that was and then you get it back and it'd be like, oh my god, like it's just so I think that's the long story of how it came about. It's just it's weird. We kind of hijacked Joan's much smaller project and turned it into a much bigger project. But it all worked out in the end. Here we are talking about it. So it's I mean, like you say, I mean, it's a brilliant organizing structure, because you also go back to all these Steely Dan songs and you think like, right, these are all about, again, these characters, these seedy underground characters, and they're always on the verge of a nervous breakdown or a drug deal, and so it's just this perfect way to get into them. And no, I mean, I it's like the moment I heard what it was, I was like, that's perfect. That is perfect. And it also allows you to do this amazing thing where, I mean, so I got to read a galley. Again, my fandom is strong enough that someone at my work was like, I'm getting him a galley. And so I've had the chance to go over and read it all. And it's just like, you get to do these great pocket histories of all these kind of, the constellation of weird characters that existed in the band, tangentially around the band. I mean, I think about the G. Gordon Liddy thing, where it's like, you get to include this quote where he's like, I'm glad I went to prison. I'm proud of it. I'd do it again. Like, these maniacs, these people who are just floating around in that time period
fascinating. So I think it's such a brilliant ploy. It's a great way to break it down. And so I can't recommend it enough for that alone. And the art is amazing. This isn't a question. I'm just gushing now. I can't help myself.
Go ahead. No, look. I sat in this room for a year, sort of thinking everybody was going to hate this. So like, I'm not tired of this yet. I might at some point be like, oh, the adulation makes me feel so ill. But like, I'm not there yet. No, I mean, it was. Thank you, but it's like it was just such a cool way to think about it, because then it was like, oh, like then now I can see like, oh, I'm gonna write about like whatever I can see through the keyhole of this character becomes like something I can put in this book. And so it's not just about Steely Dan. It tries to be about their era, and the times that shaped them. Because I actually feel like, as esoteric as they were, like they were really kind of reporting the news in some like weird, sideways kind of way about their time. And I think they're very much like representative figures of their time. These guys who are, kind of they participate in everything that's happening in the 60s to the extent that they do. Donald takes a bunch of acid. He's written about this, and like, they lived that whole life, and they, and like then kind of moved on and watched what happened as the 60s kind of, spread across the land in the 70s, like, and how, then what that was like, and how that changed people's lives and all of that. And I think that's like the kind of bigger story that's being told in the whole Steely Dan canon, in addition to these kind of very small, sort of seedy, kind of noirish tales that they're telling about people at the end of various ropes. So I thought that was the funnest part about, doing a band like this, that I think it did open it up to, I feel like they were very much like of their time, and you could talk about their time by talking about them.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I was going to, so, I mean, it's book is like insanely, incredibly, beautifully well researched. And, I mean, just like there is, I was going through just like the, I guess, the back here to find like all the reference, like what are these, where did all these things come from? And there's like a CompuServe interview they gave in 2002. And so I kind of think of like, and I guess correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think of like Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder when they were making Young Frankenstein. Were like, if we could just keep making this movie forever, we'd be the happiest people on the planet. And I kind of imagine that's you digging through every piece of Steely Dan ephemera forever. So yeah.
Of course. No, I mean, that's like just reading just old rock magazines that don't exist anymore, like just like things that you've never even heard of, where like they just happen to give an interview just because they're so good and so funny that like even a bad interview, like somebody who's a good interviewers, like bad interviewers, they were good no matter what. And like even it's and they're so smart and so funny, and like just following like everything that they said like that just is incredibly enjoyable to go and just read all of this kind of back matter and ephemera that's out there about them, for sure. And then reading all the sort of tangential stuff that like has nothing to do with them, like just getting into, like, we just published today on the Expanding Dan Substack newsletter, which is a great, if anybody Steely Dan fans, like Jake from Expanding Dan is doing the, like, he's doing like a sort of like primary source research in a way that that I kind of didn't. He's like talking to every person who played on these records and like getting those stories, or that's how it started, because he did this big wax poetic article about the making of the Steely Dan records, but then he's now just kind of covering other Dan related topics. But he just excerpted a chapter about dildos, like
yes. Beautiful painting of dildos in that chapter.
Beautiful in the style of Philip Guston's Monument. If you've ever seen that, it's like it's that, but like it's made out of dildos. And that was not my idea. I figured out that we needed to do it. Like, added a chapter at some point. I was like, we need to talk about the band being named after a famous literary dildo. They're named after this, a device that appears in William Burroughs' Naked Lunch. And I wanted to write about that and about Burroughs a little bit, because he was an influence that they had to really downplay, because it was the thing they got asked about in every interview, so they got tired of talking about it. But then I was kind of like, does that make the dildo is called Steely Dan? Does that make it the most famous literary dildo? And so I did a week of like just reading about, other sort of dildos in literature, and like what the sort of famous one, like what would be the previously the most famous literary dildo, and like where that appeared. And I mean, this is the magic of collaboration, because I was kind of like, okay, I think I need to ask Joan to paint a dildo. And like I sort of envisioned it. I was picturing kind of like, I don't know if I ever talked to her about this, but I was sort of envisioning like, that thing that they have at the barber shop where it's like, these are the 30 haircuts that you can get.
Sure.
Sign that's like all the sort of the different. Here's the different fades
right.
that are
cut,
available.
Buzz cut, this.
The box fade, and the thing of like, I want this, I want waves or whatever. Like I was just picturing like that, but for like dildos. And but the Philip Guston, it's like beautiful. It's kind of in like sunset colors. Like it's really nice. And so it like that. Again, that's better than I could have imagined. That was so. But I'm like reading about sort of 14th century poetry or whatever about this. So I kind of like that's what I like about the thing about like magazine writing and writing short for things is that you're always teaching yourself everything there is to know about a subject for a month, and then you don't ever use any of this information again. But you spend so much time digging into the history that you end up with all of this kind of random knowledge about like strongman competitions, or the life of Jean-Claude Van Damme, and like maybe you could find a way to use it. But yes, I could probably have just mulched doing research in this room for like I wrote this one pretty fast, but like I could have taken 3 years to do it. And there's still stuff that I like would want to get into further, like Kathy Berberian, who's the opera singer who's mentioned in Your Gold Teeth too.
Fascinating.
So interesting. And like I knew nothing of, like I had sort of Googled her at one point to figure it out, like once like just because as a Steely Dan fan you're like, who even is this? I thought it was like a friend of theirs. I thought it was somebody they knew, and they just kind of put her name in there, but she's not. She's this amazing sort of avant-garde she's I think like the most avant-garde singer that I can really sort of think of, like somebody doing things with their voice that is on a level like with a John Cage or like an Ornette Coleman or something like that. And like but also super interested in pop music and in like the Beatles. Like she did a record of like really crazy vocal Beatles covers. And was really trying to, and was like really trying. And I didn't really know any of this, and like was really trying to bring not sort of to gentrify the Beatles by making them into opera or classical music, but like actually saying to her establishment, to the sort of composed music establishment, that like this is where it's at. And it's like she was trying to lead. They were the horse that she was trying to lead to the water of the Beatles, and not the other way around. And like I thought that like she's just really, really cool. Like there's a documentary of her where she's got like sort of doing her interviews, her talking head interview. She's got a drink in her hand and a gold chain and a black turtleneck, and you're just like, this is the hippest person. This is one of the hippest people who ever lived. And like just getting into all that and just reading about John Cage and all of it. So it's like. I hope like the joy of finding these weird connections, between Steely Dan and the larger world of, culture and history and all that is like, it sort of comes through in the book. If that's the case, then we have won. We have succeeded.
I'm going to, yes, it happens.
Yes. All right, good.
I'm going to, for me, you get my stamp of approval. That's one.
All right. Good.
Now
good.
Everyone else. We're gonna find.
I trust you. The focus group of one. That's great.
Thank you. Yeah. I am the everyman. Truly.
Well, the man on the street, just outside. Yeah, outside.
Exactly. I was gonna ask. So, was there any? So, because again, it's so well researched. There's so many great little tidbits and things, stuff that's like lore and things that I had never heard before. But like, is there anything you were like dying to get in the book that just couldn't get in?
Um, yeah, but it's not like I don't know that it's exactly like what you're asking about. Like there was stuff there does like come a point where you're like, no one but me is going to know that this isn't in here. So I can let go of this thing that I've been meaning to write, or this thing that there's a few things that I started working on, because I wrote this in a very kind of modular way where it was like they're all individual little files within a larger like Scrivener document. And so I would just kind of move around within the thing as I was like, oh, it's this, like, I think I got something for this today, or I'm going to tackle this and kind of bring that, like revise the first draft version of this thing or whatever it is. And, there were certain ones that just didn't get finished to the point that I like them. And it was, if they were not essential to the story, I didn't use them. But there was a whole thing about like, there was going to be like a sort of epilogue-ish chapter that was going to be about these two kind of semi-obscure, pretty obscure Steely Dan remix albums. One of them is a record called Danable by Sex, CEX, the electronic musician, who did a really great, you can get it, it's on Bandcamp. I think both of these are on Bandcamp. A record made entirely out of really small Steely Dan samples that almost feels like if the Steely Dan albums are like a nice clock or something. It's like you hit the clock with a hammer and then you build something out of what it explodes everywhere. Like, and then it's like, and the other one was a thing that my friend Ben Lambo, who's he's Freddie Gibbs's manager, made slowed and throwed, screwed and chopped Steely Dan called Slowy Dan. And so it was going to be I was going to write about these two things. I might still do it because I started a newsletter just to, for promotional things, and I got to figure out stuff to do there. And so I might actually just write this just at some point. So I should probably not be talking about it, but it's fine. I'm talking about it. Like that was going to be in there. So I was going to talk about those things. And I think that, that was going to be about just basically how like this impulse to tinker with Steely Dan, to figure out like how it works. So Slowy Dan was really important to me because you really get a different sense of how the parts fit together by listening to it at half speed. Like you're sort of like, oh, here comes that guitar part, and like you can really sort of hear it come in. It's almost like it breaks the spell that the original recording puts on you, and you can kind of hear how it's working because it's coming at you kind of underhand, over the plate.
Yeah. Yes.
But so Ben is thanked in the book, but like you won't know why unless he listens to the podcast, because there's nothing about Slowy Dan in the book. And yeah, I don't know. I think there was probably things that were like I could have gone further down the rabbit hole, and sometimes it was about time and efficiency and all. And like I said, it was that feeling of like, this is going to be, the reader is not going to be ill-served if this isn't here. I can ill-serve myself a little bit. Like I have the thing that I want to do. And like, the most important thing is finishing the book, So I think that was kind of like where it would, where it goes. I probably could have done way more about John Davola, who's the California photographer who takes pictures of burned Malibu beach houses, which I feel like are some of the most Steely Dan-ish images in a way. They really sort of speak to me about like the vibe of Gaucho, where it's almost like, the 70s are coming to an end and we're kind of, looking around at the carnage of this time.
What's left.
And so John Davola was this guy who would go out, he's this photographer who would go out to he started photographing like I think like abandoned buildings that had been not abandoned buildings that had been like eminent domained for like it's not LAX, it was like some other airport that was maybe somewhere in Orange County, like one of those airports. And so these buildings were going to be torn down, but like in the meantime, there were just these sort of abandoned structures that people would go in and kind of like fuck with and like spray paint and stuff. And like he would do it too, because he was very much about breaking the photographer rule of like your own intervention being part of it. So he would make weird spray paint marks in these structures, or like throw like a newspaper in the air and take a picture of that. So it would be, his hand would be somehow present in the work. And then he did this series where he kept going back to this one empty beach house in Malibu that was used by, I think, like basically, you know, teenagers and like vagrants as like a hangout, but also by the fire department, who would use it to practice putting out fires. So they would set it on fire and put it out, you know, put it out, and eventually it burned to the ground in one of those things. But like he's taking these beautiful pictures where like it's this framed window, like he would shoot through a window so you could see the beach outside and the placid kind of like calm ocean at sunset. He would go very early in the morning or very late when there'd be nobody there. So it was either at dusk or at dawn, and there'd be this beautiful kind of like expanse outside the window of, of ocean, sea and sky, calm sea and sky that doesn't care about us and is going to be the same no matter what. And then it would be framed by this like just incredibly fucked up house that was like had burned right. curtains and like weird kind of like Twin Peaksy sort of graffito on the wall and everything. And like something about that just felt so, especially gaucho, especially the late, very California Steely Dan stuff from the 70s, where it was like, you know, the sort of the juxtaposition, which is the sort of the juxtaposition that's always happening in LA, where it's like, you know, whatever is going on the ground, whatever sort of the man-made world and whatever the chaos of our world. And then you can look and there's some beautiful purple mountain majesty in the distance, or the ocean, or something like that is, you know, that, like I said, doesn't care about us, doesn't feel anything. It's just something like, and like I said, that's like, you know, topic for further investigation, I guess. Like, so he's in there and mentioned as a reference point, but it was definitely like, I imagine that being much longer. As you can see, since I just talked about it for 45 minutes without you letting me say anything. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's, I mean, it's fascinating. That was I love that. And it's kind of it is a metaphor for Steely Dan in many ways, right? I feel like they give you this beautiful packaged sort of uncaring perfection. You know, if you were to be negative about it in the way that some people can, they would say it's like it's almost sealed tight, kind of no room to breathe, but it's airless, the sky. It's beautiful, airless. And then you just if you were to pull back just 5 feet, you're like, oh, I'm in this burned house of that's graffitied and destroyed. And it's all great. And it's amazing. And it's kind of a perfect metaphor.
Yeah. So I talked about it in the context of Third World Man, the last song on Gaucho, you know, the really the sort of the moment when basically Steely Dan Mark I, the 70s version, just kind of like limps across the finish line. And that's the end of them until like 1993. Like they're just exhausted and worn out, and they don't, you know, they sort of basically break up, like not really acrimoniously, but they just are like, we're not going to do this anymore. We can't, you know, do this to ourselves. We've tortured ourselves with the quest for perfection for too long. And so I kind of, and that song is about a burning house. And you know, I think that's, you know, how I got there somehow. But like that's the, you know, it was one of those things where it's like nobody needs that to understand this necessarily. And like I had to say, like it's not, that's always when you're writing, it's like, this is, you know, my wife is a writer as well, and we always talk about this, that, you know, no one knows but you what it was supposed to be like in your head before it happens. And like that's also I mean, it's the Steely Dan thing too. It's like they didn't care about that. They didn't care that no one would know. They're like, we have to get it to the level where we wanted it, where like it has to be the thing that we have imagined. It has to sound like what we thought it should sound like. And you know, that's how you end up doing 250 takes of you know, a 2-word phrase in the song "Home at Last" for Asia. Like, and you just kind of, you know, you just ruin your life and your health and your mind and everything. And I think that's like, you know, that's what happened there.
They are fascinating, and that they do fall into some of the trappings of the band, like obviously like of rock and roll bands at that time, like Walter's drug addiction that seems to worsen as the decade goes on. But it's like more than anything, it's like they ruin themselves at the idea of perfection. Like they're not tired of the road, really. I mean, they just quit it. They're smart enough to be like, we're done. And they're just like, they lose their minds in the studio, and they're like, we need an entire decade to just chill out. It's kind of there are not many bands like that who are just that, you know, that tight. I mean, it's just, it's amazing. Yeah.
Well, right, where that's the reason, like that you have
Yes,
to stop doing it. Like clearly, like Walter's struggles with all of with addiction didn't, I'm sure, hastened that ending, but bands like go on and like function through that, and like a band like Steely Dan like maybe even could have, because Walter was like, it wouldn't, he's famously said like it wouldn't bother me to not play on my own record, and like a lot of gaucho, like that's the case. Like it's mostly if you're mostly just writing music for other people to play, like theoretically. But there was something I think about, you just like, I think because Donald didn't have Walter so much by the end, like he's sort of like, you read the stories, like there's a Rolling Stone profile that sort of they like had a writer in the studio while they were finishing Gaucho, and it's just Donald is just miserable at the console, like engaged in this very kind of painstaking, exacting, painful Steely Dan process, and he doesn't have Walter, who's the guy who, I mean, like, I think the sort of animating thing of Steely Dan is these two guys amusing each other, literally making each other laugh, like telling each other, like having a really shared sense of humor and a shared sort of, like in jokes and all of that, but also kind of like being like, wouldn't it be great if we did this? Wouldn't it be great if it sounded like that? It's like they were pleasing themselves first as artists, and then once once like Walter doesn't have Donald, once Donald doesn't have Walter, it changes. It changes the dynamic, I think, and made it probably harder to be to continue wanting to do this, like because so I think that's like this is very much a love story, I think, between two guys. It's a creative love story, and it's and then they kind of they reunite at the end, which is awesome. Like they kind of they meet back up, but like in the meantime, like without what Donald has said, like it was really hard for him to learn to write without Walter as the the foil and the buffer and the guy who finished the sentences, as it were. And that's why it took so long after the Nightfly comes out. It's like Nightfly is 82, and then he doesn't do anything for decades after that.
You kind of said that in the book, and I kind of love the way that you're interpreting all these things. Obviously, you're like the expert, but you can like kind of hopefully read the tea leaves in a way where it's like you kind of say he just needs a guy to kind of give himself. You're right to end the sentences, but to like almost give him a buffer from people being like, those are Donald Fagen's thoughts, like only Donald Fagen. Like he needed the extra guy to also help him just be like, I'm not just the only one thinking or saying these things. I have someone else with me. And then it's ultimately the character you kind of keep returning to, Mr. Steely Dan, which I think is so interesting.
It's like a way to use the first person and to have the power of the first person without necessarily having everybody assume that it's you. Like there's the implication, correct or not, when we hear a singer-songwriter use the word I, that they're talking about, that the character they're talking about is themselves. And it might not, it's probably often untrue, and like people make stuff up all the time. That's they're artists, but like we as a listener, you're sort of, you assume that like, oh, this is like James Taylor is talking about his experience, like, and about what's real to, the things that really happened, things he really felt like, and Steely Dan had all of these kind of distancing devices that made you question that. But I think it was also that like, yeah, there's something about like they sort of met in the middle, and they kind of imagined this person who did things that maybe they wouldn't have done necessarily, like,
right.
Because that's the, the one, like the character that doesn't get depicted in this book. We kind of went with everybody who's a proper name. But the other sort of fictional protagonist that's floating through all of these songs is Mr. Steely Dan, is this I who is kind of a very, it's not, and I think sometimes it's Donald, sometimes it's Walter, sometimes though they're imagining sort of like, what if this guy, what would some person who's not us do? And I think there's just, it was weird. It seems like, and he's talked about this, I think it was strange for him, and it required some adjustment to write without a partner, just because it was just you out there. But then, that felt sort of exposed, I think, in a way that, he didn't before. But, also Nightfly is very much like steeped in kind of a boomer childhood that is very much Donald's background and his story. And like, he's writing about like having a party in the fallout shelter in the backyard in the suburbs and all of that. And I think, but that's what I love. I mean, I read about this in the book, but like the reason the solo albums, in addition to being great solo albums, they're in their own merits, just as records, like a record like 11 Tracks of Whack by Walter Becker's, first solo album, or the Nightfly, or, all of those, is that you can start to see who was contributing what. Like, once you listen to the songs they wrote by themselves, the lyrics they wrote and sang by themselves, like, it sort of illuminates maybe a little bit of what the contribution was. Like, it's never precise, obviously, but you can see a little more about what each of those two guys was bringing to the table in their collaboration. So I think those are worth it. For that reason. I mean, I think they're great. I've been really on a 11 Tracks of Whack bender again lately.
Interesting. I love Nightfly, but I have not. That's one I like. Give it a run every once in a while, but I've not really dug into 11 Wax of Tracks. I'll have to do that.
It's really like, I mean, it sounds like it's very much of its era in terms of production. And it's, if that stuff grates on your ear, then it's going to be hard. It's a little bit of a 90s, it sounds like a 90s studio album, like but I think that's kind of what I love about it. And, I wish, I've said this a lot, but I wish that we had more of Walter's stuff out there. I wish there was more than just the two. That and Circus Money. I wish there's kind of a bigger solo corpus, but it's Steely Dan. They don't work fast. They're prolific is not the word.
Yeah. Well, so all over the place, but I'm going to back this up a little bit because you've just reminded me with the idea of grating on people's ears, because it is a very specific sound. And I think it's an acquired taste that you kind of have to, I don't know, like you're following the music. The music's, you're not, the music lets you in. You don't let the music into your life, I think, in many ways. And I've found that way. And you kind of detailed the way you came to the fandom in the book. And I think it's the first time I like truly was like, that is exactly it. You almost come to it like, with a semi-ironic, wouldn't it be funny if I listened to Steely Dan kind of thing? And because you've heard them all, again, there's 7 huge radio hits. Like, I grew up with a dad who only listened to classic rock radio. So I'm like, I like Do It Again. I like Real in the Ears. What is the other stuff? I mean, I've gotten further down the path and it's like a little too funky, jazzy, weirdness for me. And then all of a sudden it just starts to slowly creep up on you, and it creeps up, and then you kind of move up the timeline with them until, for me, my girlfriend is like, why are we listening to Gaucho again? How do you like this? What is happening? And there's just like something where it's like, I don't know, something primal lizard brain in the back of my mind has clicked into place, and now I love this. So is that was sort of your experience, if you just want to talk about like the semi-ironic beginnings of now something that you love so much?
Yeah. I mean, I'm 45. Like, my kind of moment of, really that there's, the moment that your taste kind of takes shape, like when, like when you're 18, 19 or whatever, that was for me, it was punk rock and indie rock and things that, and like hip hop, but like, certain kinds of hip hop where like grit was really important in the sound, and like a sort of like a real sort of, made on cheap samplers kind of DJ Premier, Bomb Squad kind of thing, like all of that. Like, and, I think there was a set of kind of prejudices that I internalized from reading rock criticism of that time, and just from what I was into and what I kind of, associated with authenticity and realness. And a lot of it was production sound. It was like the way that things sounded, because if it sounded dirty, if it sounded a little fucked up, a little lo-fi, like, you kind of knew that was, you were in safe territory. And, I was like, anything that sounded too slick and too studio is just, is not for me. And, I would be very much like, so it's like, that includes like jazz after a certain point, like,
right. Sure.
Like it just, you'd be like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. And over time you start to figure out that those things are dumb, like those rules are, that like you don't,
Right.
you're but yeah. So I think the way that I like, probably like, I've sort of told this origin story a lot, but like it was the Minutemen, the great San Pedro punk band, the Minutemen punk trio, Mike Watt, D Boon, George Hurley, covered on their probably their best album, Double Nickels on a Dime. They covered Dr. Wu, along with a few other things. They covered "Ain't Talking About Love" by Van Halen, and so there's a Creedence cover. Like they're sort of working their way into these various kind of classic rock things. And it turns out that the reason they covered Dr. Wu is because George Hurley, the drummer, was a huge Steely Dan fan. He was always like playing Steely Dan in the van as they were touring. And so they record this version where it's, two vocals. It's Mike Watt in either speaker, kind of, just don't seem right. I was stuck out here all night. It's like a little bit, it kind of turns it into like a country song a little bit. And I think at some point this was, we're talking now about like the late 90s when I would have been getting into this, like discovering this. That record's from like 1982, I think. But like I sort of was really, my big phase of Minutemen fandom was later because I was too young. So late 90s, when you could buy a lot of classic rock vinyl for like $1, which is no longer really the case. It used to be like before streaming, the best way to sort of like, the best like bargain way to kind of investigate the canon was vinyl, because vinyl was really cheap. And like now it's like, it's ridiculous now. It's like, everything's $40. It's crazy. So I bought a copy of Katy Lied because it had Dr. Wu on it, and I wanted to know what the original Katy Lied, what the version of Dr. Wu sounded like. And there was an element of like, can you believe, what if I bought a Steely Dan record today? Like, and just kind of in the way that, but it was also like a curiosity, because you would see certain things in the bin all the time. And like, and eventually it would be like, like you could buy based on covers and based on, things that you're sort of like, I always wanted, and so I feel like there was, there's this one record store in Boston that I probably got, the 12 best Joni Mitchell albums for $12 there over the years. And like things that were sort of, like just at that time, just nobody was checking for, because it wasn't like, deep funk or something that you could sample really. And it was just kind of like there in the bins. But I think, it was initially I'm taking way too long. This story is supposed to get shorter as I tell it again, but it's getting longer every time.
More detail, more texture.
More
I
detail.
love it.
There I am. I've
what
just eaten
color
at
was
Subway.
what's the sign? Tell me that.
Well, you would go downstairs. It was a downstairs record store on
I love that.
in Boston. So you'd go down to like kind of this basement space it was like shared. It's like if you went, I forget what was, there was maybe like a computer store on the right, and then on the left was In Your Ear. And I bought so much stuff there because it was like 40 records for $20 or something like that. And so like there's like a lot of my collection grew a lot from that place. And there were just Steely Dan records. And so I ended up, coming back to Katy Lied and being like, listening to the rest of Katy Lied and being like, okay, this is not the sort of Spyro Gyra fusion bullshit that I was sort of told that it was by the sort of slightly older rock critics of my time that I was reading and kind of internalizing and taking as gospel. Like, and there's something else going on here than what I was sort of informed that this was. Because a lot of the stuff that follows in Steely Dan's wake, a lot of fusion is kind of bad, like there's a lot that's good, but there's a whole lot of chaff in with the wheat. And the yacht rock stuff is like, in a lot of ways, some of it is really cool and like really like fun to listen to, but it doesn't necessarily have the kind of multi-layered thing going on that Steely Dan has. And so it's like some of those prejudices are right. Like some of that music is bad, and some like, like jazz from the 1980s, like gets harder to, it's like, it's not one of those things where it's like any jazz record from 1964 is going to be pretty great. Like, you know, it's going to sound pretty good. And like, it's just going to, as you go further in. So it was this thing where it was like, okay, this isn't what I was told that it was. This isn't the thing that I sort of assumed that it was from people making jokes about like this was the thing. I was the person who could make jokes about, I was like, oh, does this have Waddy, Skunk, and Cooch playing their tasty licks on it, you know? And like, I would make that joke, and I didn't know who those guys were. Like, I didn't know like Waddy Wachtel, Skunk Baxter, and like Janie Korchmar. Like, that was sort of like, you know, but so those are the names of like famous like session guys who played on Steely Dan records in some cases. At least Skunk Baxter was in the band at first. Like, but that idea of like, you know, oh, like music made by high price session guys in studios, these guys like, you know, just their egos out of control doing cocaine and like this slick music, like that's not for me. Like I like it like a hardcore music, like a working class music of, you know, of Sebado or something, you know, like that kind of thing. You know, working real Joe Lunchbox types like Lou Barlow, like that, you know, no disrespect, Lou. It's just so, yeah, but like yeah. So I just, it was a set of prejudices, and like, you know, like kind of then that's what life is. Like you realize that your sort of assumptions are wrong, and you kind of recalibrate based on that. And, you know, there was just so clearly, like, if you listen to something like Your Gold Teeth 2 or from Katie Lied, or even you listen to Dr. Wu, like there's there's mysteries that you can't unravel, and there's stuff that you want to dig further into. And it sort of works for me anyway. Like this stuff works on an emotional level that, you know, I didn't expect it to. And, you know, I think and then by the time I was like a little older and like moved to New York and was like actually like working for the, you know, for rock magazines, writing for, you know, and like kind of my peers are all sort of like, you know, rock magazine bros, those, you know, it was the 2000s. It was very much like, you know, we were living in New York and covering like the, you know, the sort of explosion of like cool new New York bands that had come out of the, you know, the Strokes happening, and, you know, LCD Sound System and things like that. And, you know, like, if that was sort of our job. And so, you know, the rebellion I think that we engaged in was, we're not going to, after work, we're not going to go out to shows and like kind of go see these bands live. It's like, there's like, no one who's never worked for a rock magazine will understand this, but there does like come a point where like in that, where you're like, the last thing you want to do at the end of the day is go see a fucking band. And like, that sounds so entitled. It's like, I don't care that sounds entitled. I know that there's no way that's not going to set that. Like, some people like, no, like if you like the idea that like you can grow to, you know, to sort of like to hate contemporary music if it's your job, in the same way that you could grow to hate sandwiches if you work at a sandwich place. So we would go home and like hang out and like, you know, hang out at each other's houses, and we would be listening to Steely Dan, and we would be listening to Grateful Dead bootlegs, and kind of talking about that. And that was the way that was like, you know, because like, how do you like say like fuck the man if the man is your boss at the rock magazine, and the man is telling you like, you know, you need to be out at Mercury Lounge, like, you know, watching the Walkmen play or something. And it would be like, no, we're gonna listen to Europe 72 and talk about it. You know, that's it. So it's, yeah. And like, I think that was, so there's like really it was a private thing and a small thing, and then it became something that was like kind of my friends and I had in common, and we would talk all about that and just be like, what are these records, how do you write Gaucho, like how do you write that song Gaucho, like what is going on with this, like this dude in a spangled poncho, like what's that, like, yeah, this kind of wild sort of homoerotic fantasia set in a fictional Superdome, a fictional sports arena. Like, it's just like, yeah, it's the craziest shit. And so that was like, it just, once I did any actual investigation of this, like everything that I had thought about it was clear. It was revealed, you know, to be wrong. And like that there was a, you know, and that I think honestly, like they're, you know, Steely Dan are, except in the way that they sound, like so punk and so kind of like in the spirit of, you know, because like I was like, Steely Dan is not for me, but like my favorite band was Pavement, like that sort of, and it's like it's
right.
Who are in so many ways like the, you know, in that kind of like obfuscatory way that Steely Dan is, they're so much aligned with that. And like Malcolmus has talked about, like, it is on record as being a fan of, of that music in a way. So it like, yeah, it's all like, I don't think people though grow up in the same way that I did anymore. Like, I don't think that, like, I think the part of the reason they're so popular now and that sort of young people are getting into Steely Dan, younger people, is that I don't think that I just don't think that, like, the sort of your average like 22-year-old has absorbed as many fucking record reviews as I had by that age, and as many sort of written by people older than them. I just don't think it's the same. I think it's like maybe you're reading Pitchfork, but like I don't know that that's sort of, it's just not as central to the way people consume stuff. Because when you're young, it's like at that point, or like for me, it was like almost like, oh, I feel like I'm catching up on like decades of culture, and like I need, it's useful, or it feels useful to have somebody tell you like, this stuff over here you don't need to worry about, and you don't need to, it's like you don't need to pay attention.
Yeah, write it off. You're good. Yeah, you don't need it. Yeah.
It's like Jonathan Lethem has talked about like the urge among rock critics to say that X new Bob Dylan thing is his best since Blood on the Tracks, because it allows you to sort of leave out everything that happened between Blood on the Tracks and this. Like, it's sort of, don't worry, and like as I've gotten older, like I've started to feel like that sort of writing that way is like a disservice to the person that you're is reading you, because you're sort of like, or a disservice to art or something like that you're just kind of like, you don't ever want to be the person saying, this is not, don't worry, this is not worth you paying attention to it. Like, I feel like that's kind of it's like not a, responsible way to talk about things, which is, so it's been interesting to see, like, why the Steely Dan thing has developed, among the sort of the resurgence of Steely Dan fandom among younger people, because I think it's really down to like, the gatekeepers are kind of not at the gate anymore. There's nobody keeping the gate. There's nobody saying like, like at a certain point, if you were a young person trying to figure out whether or not you should like Steely Dan, it's like, I don't have it here, but like my Bible was like the Spin Magazine alternative record guide, which is like this big sort of compendium. Like, and it's a great book, and there's like really great writing in there, but like Steely Dan's not in there. So it was like, okay, I don't need to worry about, clearly like they've sort of grandfathered in like certain people as being alternative. And so it's like Kiss is in here and Captain Beefheart is in here and whatever. And so like, I will further investigate those things. And like, King Sunny a Day or whatever, like I will go back to those. But I don't need to worry about Steely Dan. And like, if you were sort of like at a younger age, you would look at the first edition of the Rolling Stone book and see Dave Marsh being like, these early Steely Dan records are okay, but they got sort of too jazzy and too abstruse after a while, and like, thumbs down, sort of to that. And so you would be like, okay, I don't have to worry about that. I don't think I don't know that same thing happens. Like, I don't in the same way. I think it's because of streaming, because it's so easy to check stuff out and not really sort of, and just experience it almost in a vacuum, like sort of divorced from like a cultural context. Like, I think that's kind of useful in a way, because you can just listen to it. And if you listen to Steely Dan, like, you're like, oh, this is a really, like, these are very pleasing albums. There's something really, like, you're hearing kind of amazing musicians at the top of their game playing the weirdest shit you've ever heard. And like, if it's just there, I think that like, it's just, they're more likely to work on you in that way, because if you don't have kind of those things, any of those prejudices going for you, that's
absolutely. Well, so I mean, I fall firmly into the Danisance that you sort of like, millennial Danisance, where it's like, I think probably just before Walter Becker died in 2017, I was just starting to get into them. And I think that movement was happening. It was kind of interesting to see that thing. And I feel like when he passed away, that like kicked it into overdrive for me. And then it was interesting to find all these other people who were also sort of experiencing the same thing of like, these guys are great. These are awesome. And I thought it was just kind of a fascinating, your point that it's like, they kind of hadn't been strip mined for nostalgia yet either. Like, they were not a thing that was just completely, laid waste to by people being like, what was great. it's like there was still the overlapping resentment or overhanging resentment towards them as like the man, or again like the studio album guys, that then at a certain point it was like when the floodgates opened, they just came pouring out and you're like, this is awesome. I feel like Fleetwood Mac is kind of similar, where it's like they were sort of written off as like pop studio, the thing they want you to listen to, and then they kind of had a similar resurgence. And there was that one TikTok, but besides that, they were.
But even before that, yeah, I feel like they were starting to be. It was a weird thing to be into in like 2008. To be super, like, I remember, like, I think whenever, like, we were all really stoked about me and my rock critic bros buddies. I don't want to say bros, they're not all, but like they're not all men, but like it was that group of people. But like when they reissued Tusk with the demos for Tusk, like those like really wild sort of lo-fi Lindsey Buckingham kind of like just coked up in a men's room kind of doing vocals and claps and stuff, like the best, fucking great. And like but I think that was another thing that was kind of like had nothing to do with the sort of what was going on in the culture at that moment, arguably. And like now I feel like that is very much like being like the millennial interest in Fleetwood Mac for whatever reason. And that TikTok sort of comes at the end of it. That's like the mainstreaming of it. I think even before that, like it was kind of like this was something that people were up on. And again, I think it's something that, for a while it was like, this was the antithesis. And there was something about, it was like really important for like it's like critics and the people who are controlling that conversation used some of this music as like in order to establish the importance of something like punk or then indie rock after it and all of those things, you had to say like music had gotten shitty and it had gotten bloated. And all of these people had too much money and they were doing too much cocaine and their records were sounding bad for this and this reason. And they were self-indulgent and all of that. It's like, like I remember like there was the PBS History of Rock documentary, which is like a multi-part sort of, it's just like the whole history of the whole thing. And like, I remember watching that, and like the episode about punk, the episode that's about like the Velvet Underground and, Jonathan Richman and all of those things, like it begins with like, I think it's Rick Wakeman from Yes in an empty stadium, sound checking in an empty stadium, playing 14 organs at once and 14 synthesizers at once in like a giant empty room, and just the wankiest thing you've ever seen. And then it's like cut to John Lydon looking like he's going to burn down a nursery school. Like, and it's like, this is sort of, so it's like this, you have to say like, because it's hard to sort of make sometimes like for a mainstream kind of publication critic to make the case for punk in the same way, like you have to say like, oh, this was it had gone awry, and this kind of set the odometer back to zero and made everything. So I understand like what that impulse is, because it's like there were certain, it's like, this thing did happen, like where, the kind of the 60s icons who survived, like became this aristocracy and kind of got like further away from what they were great at. And like in many cases, and like, you kind of had to say like, okay, this was a clarifying moment, and throw a lot of stuff out with that. And I think you sort of work at like, but at the same time, like, that's like I said, it's like a set of prejudices. And so it's interesting to see people of your generation, not to be like of your generation, I'm not that much older than you, but people of a younger generation. Like I think about like, we did this, one of my favorite music podcasts out right now is Joker Men, which is two guys in their 30s who started out talking their way through all of the Bob Dylan that kind of falls in between Blood on the Tracks and his best since Blood on the Tracks, like getting into the like down in the grooves of it, and like the things that the ones that people don't necessarily talk about as much, and the ones that are like sort of look at and it's a really interesting way to look at that, because once you're like, if really getting into 80s Bob is a way to do that. But I think it's interesting because it's from the perspective of, we're all, we're going to access this in a different way, and we're going to sort of experience it in a different way. And so I try to, my perspective on Steely Dan is kind of weird because it's from before that, and it's this. I feel like it's almost like a historical blip, in a way. But I can only write from my perspective. So,
yeah. Well, it was interesting to see, again, something that I felt like, oh, I was a part of this happening, and it was kind of fascinating to see it covered in the book. Well, I just want, like, you had been talking about Katie Lyde, and this book is it goes without saying, the book is really good, and it gives you an excuse to listen along to all these things, which was like the richest experience you could ever hope for as you like go along with it. And truly, and I say this, it like makes you listen to these things in a way that I have never listened to them before, or hear things I've never heard before. And I would never, heard Katie Lyde the way that you kind of describe it, where it's like, oh, it's this kind of slightly muted. It doesn't quite, like there's just something off in the recording studio of that. And so I don't know if the book, it operates like this key that unlocked so much for me in terms of their, discography, and specifically that album, and going back to it. And is that also I guess I'm setting you up to tell the story about the mustard, and if you don't mind, because that's the most fascinating, like almost like profoundly like unbelievable thing I've heard. It's just like, it's amazing. So I just want to set you up for that and say again, like, this book it's so phenomenal in what it does to like just again unlock these things and go into the weeds on it. And so anyways, I'll let you tell that story.
I mean, that's in the liner notes to there's a really great, when they reissued those records, kind of remastered the Steely Dan catalog whenever the first time they did that in the late 90s, early 2000s, like Donald and Walter wrote these amazing liner notes for all those records. And so they talk about this in there, but there's also an essay that Denny Diaz wrote that who was in Steely Dan at that time, sort of about the experience of making that record. And to me, this is a story about like this, specifically Katie Lyde. This piece of it is, because they would go on to make records that were pretty much like, Asia is pretty much a technically perfect record. It's a sort of, I think it's also an aesthetically perfect record, but like sort of like technically it is. I met somebody recently who was like used to work in a stereo store, and like that was like what they would put on to be like, you need to hear the TK-421s. They sound just incredible. Like that would be how you would actually sort of, like when the in Boogie Nights, Buck Swope with the coffee cup. I was like, can't you hear the bass? Isn't it kicking you right? So like that was what they would in real life. Like that was what they would use. Supposedly Asia was when they were selling when they were selling record players and turntables. And then like once the Nightfly came out, it's like that was how they would sell CDs, because it would sound so good. It was so digital. It was like sort of, so they would go on to make perfect records, but like Katie Lyde is about sort of the impossible. To me, it's like the story I tell about Katie Lyde is about the impossibility of making a perfect piece of art, and like that like something is always going to be working against you, because they make this album with like, again, the best players they have. It's like they're starting to become a fully studio based band at this point, so they kind of have their pick of who's going to do it. Michael McDonald is on backing vocals and all of that. It's like it's a great Steely Dan collection of songs. They record it using this special noise reduction technology that I think is sort of, it's like similar to Dolby. I don't think it is Dolby, but maybe it's Dolby. I forget exactly what it is. And when they go to master it to vinyl, when they go to the stage of like sort of cutting with the literally like cutting with the lathe, the thing that they are going to base all of the records on, the kind of template for the records, they cannot get the sound right. They cannot get it to come across properly. And, so that's the whole story. And like no version, like they no matter what they do, they eventually just kind of give up, and like they hate Katie Lyde. Like they sort of, as a result, right. Donald and Walter end up sort of like really sort of like Katie Lyde to them is a failure. And Katie Lyde's fucking awesome. Like, but like they can't get to that. they just mentally, they know what it was supposed to sound like. And they know that like, oh, these snares sound muddy and like, it doesn't sound great. But there's all of these sort of technical problems. Like Katy Lied is like a haunted record. It's like so there's something about it. There's like gremlins sort of working against them at all times. And there's a thing, I forget exactly what it is, like the moment that they're trying to fix, it's like something in a guitar solo. It's like some little punch in that they're trying to do, like to fix some little minute kind of detail of the sound. And no matter what they do, they cannot get it to record and to stick to the tape. And they end up but they've got this master tape that they're trying to add this little bit to, and they end up sending it to like the lab, to the tape company. And look, they lied a lot about a lot of things. And like, this could be a made up story, but apparently they find out the company analyzes the tape, and they're like, as near as we can figure out, there is a drop of mustard in the somewhere in the manufacturing process. Like someone was eating a sandwich and like a drop of mustard. And as I say this to you, like, this sounds like absolute
insane.
It sounds insane, but there's something where it's like, there will always be, no matter how much you torment yourself trying to make it perfect, you are always going to be undone by human error, because you are human, and there are humans that you're dealing with humans, and you're sort of like, there's no, like, we can, like, and I don't know, maybe we're at the point now where we're getting AI into the picture, and like we can actually remove the human being from the artistic process, and like things will be truly perfect. But like, that to me it's sort of represents everything that is about Steely Dan, because they were human and flawed, and they were trying to make this perfect music. And, because we are human and flawed, we cannot make perfect objects. We cannot do it. And, we're not, so there's something there's something about that I just find so kind of heroic and, funny, that they're trying to do this, and that, they like, and it's because like, some joker at the factory like has made this mistake, and like the tape is defective and all of that. But, and yeah, it's, so there's no, you don't really know what Katy Lied is supposed to sound like. And like the best, I think, example of this too is, in some ways, the best Steely Dan song, the most representative Steely Dan song, is the second arrangement. It's the song that they were recording for Gaucho. It's a great song. It would probably be the best song on Gaucho. It would probably be as big of a hit as like, Pay 19 or whatever had it come out. But it never did, because they were recording it and they sort of took forever to record it. And at some point, an engineer erased the master tape, like went back over the master tape to do some kind of a pass that they had to do, some sort of junior engineer, and they lost like their sort of master recording. They had finally gotten it down the way that they wanted it, and it was lost, and they could never recreate it. And so there's versions of it floating around, and people have cleaned it up and fixed and sort of tried to, fix this. And like, it's at somebody said this to me, but like at some point somebody's gonna AI this and make a version of the second arrangement, and I'm gonna have to, be like, how do I feel about this? We're gonna be confronted with, like, somebody's gonna be like, this is what it was supposed to be. But right now it doesn't exist in any sort of finished form. And so it's kind of the thing that, it's the mountaintop that they never got to, and that they sort of dissolved as a band because they couldn't. That's why, like, it's why they had to pull out. It's why Third World Man is on Gaucho, because they had to pull out another song from kind of the racks a little bit, some of the older material, to kind of fill that spot, because they're like, forget it, we're not ever going to get second arrangement back. We're so broken by this process. We're so dispirited, and we're never going to be able to. It's never going to be what we want it to be. And it's like, you didn't ask this question, but like, when you're writing a book, these are the kind of things that you think about too. It's like any sort of big creative project or whatever, you want it to be, what it was supposed to be in your mind. And, you are up against, what you like, if you're psychologically healthy, this isn't as much of a problem, but if you struggle in any way with this stuff, you know what you wanted it to be, and you're fighting again. You're like, no, I'm trying to get it down in a way that sort of is the way that it reads in my head. And like, if you can't get there, it's really frustrating. And, you know, it was amazing to be writing this book and writing about perfectionism, writing about the sort of how perfectionism can ruin you and undo you, while also sort of having the perfectionist impulse kind of plague me as it does sort of as me as a writer, and like sort of struggling with that same thing. And kind of like it was ironic because I would be sort of thinking one thing of like, oh, it's so sad that they couldn't get out of their own way and kind of experience this thing. But then at the same time, I was like, if this book isn't fucking perfect, like I'm going to jump in front of traffic. Like it's sort of, and like, you know, that. So like it's, you know, and you know it, it's just your mind is like, you've compartmentalized these two things. You're able to sort of hold these two thoughts in your head at once. But it was like, yeah, it's like, because you're, you know, being perfectionist in a book about the kind of the wages of perfectionism, yeah, the ultimate perfectionist and all of that, the John McEnroes of you know, of the studio. It's like, yeah, it's ironic and funny, and you're, you know, but yeah, we can only we have to try, though. We have to try to make the thing that's in our heads. We got to try to build the mind palace and in real life.
I think, as you put it in the book, and again, it's something that will stick with me, is the tombstone of like good intentions, or the tombstone of perfectionism. It's like, that's all you can build really at the end of the day, of what's in your mind. And I think that, well, I think we've like looped back around to like the perfect, most Steely Dan kind of ending we could have found possible. A perfectionist trying to write about perfectionists is like, that's a Steely Dan character.
That yes, in the he is doomed, that guy.
And then he's doomed.
He's
truly
doomed, and he's telling himself that he's not doomed. Everybody can see it except for him. No, I mean, it's, yeah, that was what it was. That's what it's like. But you know, I think that the example, that's you know, what we can learn from Donald Walter is like, you know, you should try to make it as great as you can be, and you know, you shouldn't settle for like pretty good, you know, or whatever. Like I think there's a lot of merit in that, and like believing in like what you're doing, and believing in like, you know, actually like executing your vision in that way. But just try not to drive yourself crazy.
Don't let it destroy you.
Anybody, you know, you've just listened to you've treated yourself to a 3.5 hour podcast about Quantum Criminals by Alex Pappademas and Joan Lemay. Back to work on your masterpiece, because if you're at this point, like, yeah, I don't think anybody likes books this much who's not a writer. So you're probably putting off something you're supposed to be doing. So go and get down with that.
There's nothing writers love to do more than to put off writing. As a writer, I can say that specifically, I don't find anything to do to not write. So
yeah, exactly.
Great for that.
Well, podcasting is for. It's so that writers don't. It's a thing you can do that without, like, that's kind of like, yeah, you don't have to write for a little while, but you've done something, you've accomplished that.
It's productive.
Yeah, like I've done this every day this week. I've done something like this, and it's like, oh, it's like, it's kind of, it's, yeah, that's the, like, yeah, not having the pressure to create for a moment is, you know, that's the greatest thing ever. Like feeling like you've done something without having to write. You know, that's nothing like it. Anyway, Tyler, I'm going to let you go.
Thank you for hosting. Now I appreciate you wrapping it up. Well, I do have one more question for you.
Yeah, please.
Gas in the car?
There is gas in the car. You know, I actually need to put. There's not gas in my car right now. Is the truth? It's the answer, but yes. In a spiritual sense. In a spiritual sense, do the people down the hall know who we are? Yes, they do. Is there gas in the car? There will be. Like by the time we need there to be, there will be. But you know, the truth is, an
old LSD chemist who needed to get on the run quickly. There would not be, but there is gas. There will be gas. Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, no, you got to ask yourself those questions. That's my, that's my favorite thing about it. I'm going to try and get that going at every event. I'm going to try and do the call out. As you know, if you've ever been to the Beacon Theater in New York to see Steely Dan, or it happens at a lot of places. But yeah, you can get the sort of like one side of the room is like, is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car. And everybody hitting that high note.
Well, here, let me. I'll let you go.
My thanks to Tyler Austin for being here on the Skylight Books podcast. I'm sorry, I'm a podcast host. I can't not. I'm it's fine. I'm overbearing. I'm sorry. It's fine. It's fine. I really appreciate you having me on here, and everybody, Skylight Books. If you're listening to this, you already know, but just come out, buy some books, drop some coin.
Books. Come up May 31st. Come see Alex live and in person. Come by Quantum Criminals. It's going to be at 1814. It'll be in our arts annex going forward, except for all the months that it's going to be my staff pick. So when it'll be in the main store.
That's right. But I love the arts annex, by the way. That's where I want to be. Oh. That's my people. That's right over there in the arts annex. It's all the graphic novel people.
Good place to be. And I mean, a more fitting, perfect sort of like it's a music book with some kick-ass art in it. I mean, that's exactly where it belongs.
It's just like it's going to be like a really cool book to just kind of like have laying around. I pick it up all the time just because it's just so visual. It's so great. And it just kind of has this kind of life to it. So it'll be there. Just walk on down the street from the main place and from the big Skylight to the smaller, to the satellite.
Skylight. Pick it
I'm
up.
just gonna be standing there next to it, hoping that I get recognized. So I'll probably be there. I'll sign it for you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.